Welcome to the debate. Today, we're walking straight into the fire, specifically the refining fire of Zechariah chapter 13. We are looking at a text that has functioned as a stumbling block for theologians and, well, a weapon for fatalists for about 2,500 years.
Yeah, it is certainly a text with a body count. We're talking about Zechariah 13, verses 8 and 9. Quote, "In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 will be cut off and perish, and the 1/3 shall be left alive." It is usually read as a grim prediction of a future military holocaust, a map of slaughter, essentially.
Exactly. But today, we are debating source material that claims we have been reading that map completely upside down. We are discussing the essay The Spiritual Anatomy of Zechariah by Zachary David Enfield. The central question we're looking at is this. Is this prophecy a literal prediction of a military slaughter where 2/3 of the population perishes? Or is it a description of spiritual anatomy, describing the necessary death of the ego, what the text calls the flesh? I will be representing the position outlined in the material, arguing that we must read this text through a canonical lens, where the cutting off of the 2/3 is actually a positive, voluntary death to self.
And I will be representing the skeptical view. I'll be questioning whether stripping terms like land and nation of their physical meaning ignores the plain reading in favor of a hyper-spiritualized framework.
So, I'll start by laying out the perspective of the material. The argument is that the traditional reading of Zechariah as a tragedy or strict judgment is a category error. It's an error caused by looking at the text physically rather than covenantally. The essay relies on a specific methodological commitment. The word interprets itself, and it points out that Israel is a verb before it is a noun. If you go back to Genesis 32, Jacob wrestles with the angel. He doesn't get the name Israel because of his DNA. He gets it because he wrestled with God and prevailed. So to be Israel is to be in a specific relational mode. And the core thesis here is that the land in Zechariah represents the Tannin state, a spiritual condition of self-sovereignty like Pharaoh. Leaving the land or being cut off is liberation from that state. It parallels Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ.
Right, and my position acknowledges the depth of that interpretation, but I challenge the aggressive linguistic restructuring required to get there. While it's true that Paul, in Romans 9, spiritualizes Israel, not all who are descended from Israel are Israel, completely detaching this prophecy from geographic Judea seems to dissolve the historical stakes. When a prophet uses words like perish and cut off, suggesting that this is a positive spiritual process is a massive leap. It risks ignoring the sheer severity of the judgment that's being described in the text. You turn a prophecy about real, physical people into a philosophy seminar.
I understand the hesitation. It does feel safer to keep the text grounded in dirt and blood, because that's how we're used to reading history. But if we read Zechariah physically, we see a crime scene. If we read it anatomically, we see a surgery. Let's dig into the definition of the land in Israel, because this is where the divergence really starts. The essay uses the analogy of the Declaration of Independence to explain this Tannin state.
The paywall concept.
Yes, the paywall. The idea is that a state is supposed to secure rights that already exist from a divine source. But when the state manufactures rights, when it says, we are the source of your dignity, it becomes a tannin, a dragon. It takes on Pharaoh's ontology, saying, my Nile is my own, I made it for myself, which is a direct quote from Ezekiel 29. So the land in Zechariah is the condition of living under that self-manufactured identity. Leaving the land is leaving that mindset.
But this is exactly where it creates the philosophical abstraction out of a prophetic warning. If the land is just a state apparatus or a mindset, doesn't the text lose its grounding? The people in Zechariah's time weren't worried about the ontology of the state. They were worried about empires burning their physical cities.
But if you look at Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the prophets didn't actually mourn territory. They mourned covenantal rupture. Israel is relational. To be cut off from the physical land was the outward sign of an internal severing from the covenant. And this brings us to the most technical part of the argument, the distinction between the Nahash and the Tanin.
Right, the two serpents. Because to the average reader, a snake is just a snake. They both go into the generic evil bucket.
Exactly. but the essay presents linguistic evidence that they represent two entirely different functions. The Nahash is the serpent of Genesis 3. The text describes it as a durum, prudent or wise. It's wisdom vocabulary. And the essay argues that the curse in Genesis 3:14, being cursed above all livestock, is actually a form of consecration.
Consecration is a very heavy word for a curse. The text says, cursed Mikol. In standard translation, that just means cursed more than all livestock.
It can, but it can also translate to set apart from. The argument is that livestock are common. They are for simple labor or sacrifice. If the Nahash is set apart from them, it operates in a unique domain. It is assigned to eat dust. And biblically, dust is the constituent material of humanity, mortality. So the Nahash is assigned to process human mortality. It swallows the consequences of the fall. And the support for this is Numbers 21 and John 3:14. Jesus explicitly compares himself to the Nahash lifted up in the wilderness.
As Moses lifted up the serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up.
Yes, and Jesus cannot be a demon. Therefore, the Nahash must be a positive prototype of the cross. It bears death. The Tanin, on the other hand, like Aaron's staff turning into a Tanin before Pharaoh in Exodus 7, is the vocabulary of empire and coercion. The distinction is vital. One bears death, the Nahash, or Jesus, and the other resists it, the Tanin, or Pharaoh.
Okay, so the Nahash accepts death to transcend it, and the Tanin denies death to maintain power. I follow the taxonomy, but I have to pull us back to the text of Zechariah 13. 2/3 will be cut off and perish. If the land is this bad Tanin state, leaving it should be good, but the text says they perish. In any normal reading of a disaster, the survivors, the 1/3, are the lucky ones. They are the faithful remnant.
And that is the inversion the essay demands we see. The 2/3 represent the Galatians 2:20 principle. They choose the cross. They die to the Pharaoh identity voluntarily. They mimic the Nahash. The essay argues that the 2/3 are the sacrifice and the 1/3 is the altar.
Meaning the 1/3 are actually the stubborn ones?
Yes. The 1/3 remain in the land. They remain in the flesh state. Because they won't die voluntarily, they have to be refined by fire. The fire is a divine pursuit of those who refuse the voluntary death.
That is a fascinating flip of the traditional remnant theology. But I struggle to buy that it's that clean. If the 2/3 are the ones who die to self, why does the text silence them? The covenant declaration at the end of the chapter, "They are my people and I am their God," is only spoken to the 1/3 who survived the fire. If the 2/3 are the ones who got it right, why aren't they carrying the banner at the end?
Because the dross doesn't speak. The 2/3 represent the old nature that has been voluntarily surrendered. Think about the logic of a seed. The seed has to die to produce the fruit. You don't talk to the dead seed husk, you talk to the fruit that emerges. The fruit is the life that exists because the seed accepted the cutting off.
Which brings us to the nature of the fire that hits the 1/3. The essay links this fire to Apollyon or Abaddon in Revelation 9. Now, historically, Apollyon is viewed as a demonic entity, the angel of the abyss. But this material claims Apollyon is not a demon, but a destroying function of God.
It does. It points out that Revelation 9 says the key was given to him. The locusts are commanded not to kill, but only to torment for a specific time. This is controlled judicial activity. The essay links this to the Passover destroyer in Exodus and the great deep of Psalm 36, which describes God's judgments. Apollyon is God's bleach. The fire targets the role, not the person.
I have to question the theological implications of that. If the fire targets the role, if the lake of fire consumes functions like death and Hades, rather than people, and this fire just burns the tannin construct out of the stubborn 1/3, does this imply everyone is saved? Does the fire just clean everyone up eventually?
The essay is careful to call it ontological inevitability, rather than sentimental universalism. It draws on the idea that evil is privation. It's an absence of good. It has no substance of its own. Once the fire burns away the privation, the lie of the tannin ego, only God remains. Because God will be all in all, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15.
The Augustinian view of evil as a hole in the Swiss cheese.
Exactly. You can't burn the cheese to save the whole. The fire burns away the corruption. So the resultant man is the humanity that emerges on the other side of this process. Whether they went through the willing death, the 2/3, or the forced refining, the 1/3, they all end up at the same confession. The Lord is my God.
It is an elegant framework. The idea that the lake of fire isn't a torture chamber, but a purification vat for reality itself, solves a lot of tension regarding the nature of God's judgment. But I wonder if this concept of unwilling refining removes the necessity of faith. If I don't want to be refined, and God burns the ego out of me anyway until I confess Him, hasn't the text just bypassed human autonomy?
The material actually argues that the refining produces the faith rather than bypassing it. It cites Romans 8:7, the mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. The unrefined self literally cannot choose God. It is addicted to the tenon lie.
So the fire isn't violating free will? It's restoring it by breaking the addiction.
Precisely. You aren't free if you think you are Pharaoh. You're a slave to your own ego. The fire dissolves the cannot. Only after the refining can the 1/3 truly say, "The Lord is my God." Not because they are forced to, but because the impediment has been burned away.
Which makes the choice in Zechariah not about the final destination, but about the route you take to get there.
Right. The Nahash path is the willing death. It is painful, but it is a partnership. The Tanin path requires the collapse of everything you built. You can walk into the wedding feast, or you can be dragged through the burning wreckage of your own ego to get there.
That is a very stark way to frame it. To summarize my perspective on all this, while the concept of the resultant man provides an elegant framework, and the critique of the state as a false god is highly relevant, I remain cautious. Reinterpreting words like perish as liberation and the radical rehabilitation of the serpent imagery requires a restructuring of plain text that I think readers need to weigh very carefully against historical understandings.
And to summarize my position, I argue that this anatomical lens provides a rigorous and hopeful resolution to a difficult text. It takes Zechariah 13, which is often read as a text of terror, and reveals it as a blueprint for ultimate redemption. It resolves the tension between God's severe judgment and His nature as the ultimate source of all things.
We can certainly agree that this debate forces a confrontation with what Israel actually means. Is it a line on a map, or is it the condition of a soul stripped of its Pharaoh logic?
It absolutely does. And it suggests that the fire, whether we meet it voluntarily or involuntarily, is ultimately purposive. Thank you for joining us as we explore this complex anatomical study of prophecy. We encourage you to consider these perspectives and look closer at the material to see where you land.
Until next time.
This has been The Debate.
Welcome back to the deep dive. I'm really glad you are tuning in with us today because we are going to do something that, I'll be totally honest, usually makes people want to just run in the complete opposite direction.
Yeah, it is definitely one of those topics.
Right. I mean, we are going to open a file that usually stays locked in the do not touch drawer of theology. We are talking about what is arguably one of the most terrifying and confusing and maybe darkest prophecies in the entire text of the Bible.
It really is a text that has kept, a lot of theologians and probably a fair share of grandmothers awake at night for the last couple thousand years.
Exactly. So we are looking at the book of Zechariah today. And specifically, we're looking at the very end of the book, chapter 13, verses 8 and 9. And for anyone listening, if you have ever tried to read through the minor prophets and you hit this specific wall, you probably just skimmed right over it because it honestly reads like a script for a horror movie.
It really does. It is incredibly jarring when you read it plainly.
Right. So let's just set the scene for you if you don't happen to have Zechariah memorized. The text is a prophecy. And on the surface, if you just read it like a standard newspaper article, it predicts that in the, quote, whole land, unquote, 2/3 of the population are going to be, quote, cut off and perish, unquote. Just totally wiped out.
Which is, that is a staggering number, 2/3 of everyone.
And it somehow doesn't get any better for the survivors because the remaining 1/3, they don't get a victory parade or anything. The text says God is going to put this third quote into the fire, unquote.
Yeah, so you have mass death followed immediately by a literal trial by fire for the traumatized survivors. It's relentlessly bleak.
Bleak is the perfect word for it. And naturally, the traditional interpretation, like the one you will usually see in the little footnotes of most study Bibles, or the one you hear in those late-night doom and gloom prophecy sermons on TV, is that this is a literal prediction of a future military slaughter, like a genocide, essentially.
That is absolutely the predominant view, yes. In theological circles, we sometimes call it the body count hermeneutic. The basic idea is that this prophecy is literally a map of a future physical war like World War III or Armageddon. And the baseline assumption there is that the land refers to a very specific country on a modern map, usually the modern nation-state of Israel. So the cutting off is interpreted as physical death by swords or bombs or, nuclear fallout. And that remnant is just a tiny group of really lucky survivors huddling in the physical ruins waiting for the dust to finally settle.
Which honestly paints a picture of God that is, well, let's be charitable and just say it's extremely severe. It basically turns the whole biblical story into a matter of survival of the fittest, or maybe just survival of the luckiest.
It does. It turns the prophecy into a complete tragedy. A story where the ultimate spiritual goal is just to try and not physically die.
But, and this is exactly why we're here today, we have a stack of fascinating research in front of us that suggests we might have been reading the supposed map completely upside down all along. Today we are doing a deep dive into an essay titled The Spiritual Anatomy of Zechariah, written by Zachary David Enfield. And I have to say, his argument is pretty radical.
It is deeply radical. It challenges the absolute foundation of how we read not just Zechariah, but prophetic literature as a whole.
He's basically asking, what if this isn't about body counts at all? What if this isn't looking at a geographical map of the Middle East? What if the death described here isn't actually the tragedy, but is in fact the entire goal?
Exactly. It's a complete paradigm shift from reading the text as a history of future physical wars to reading it as what he calls spiritual anatomy. Enfield is arguing that we need to look at the internal mechanism of how a human being, and broadly how a covenant people, is truly transformed. He suggests that Zechariah is actually describing the necessary spiritual process of stripping away the false self to finally reveal the true self.
Wow. Okay, so before we get deep into the weeds on this, and we're definitely going to get into some really heavy stuff today, involving ancient snakes and refining fires and even political philosophy, let's talk about how the author even gets to this point. Because he's not just pulling this out of thin air, right? He relies on a very specific methodology.
Right. He calls it an orthographic approach.
Yeah.
And the absolute baseline rule of this approach is really simple, but incredibly hard to execute. The rule is that the word interprets itself.
That sounds a lot like that standard Protestant slogan, Scripture interprets Scripture. It does sound like that, yes. But Enfield takes it so much further than most people do. His commitment is that absolutely no outside tradition, no matter how ancient or popular or universally accepted, is allowed to override the internal grammar of the text itself. So if we want to know what Israel means or what the land means or even what fire means in this prophecy, we don't turn on the news and we don't look at a modern history textbook. We have to look at how the Hebrew canon from Genesis all the way to Revelation internally defines those specific terms. Okay, so we are basically using the Bible as its own internal dictionary.
That's a really great way to put it, actually. He's searching for the internal logic of the canon. And his main point is that quite often our traditions, the things we just casually absorbed in Sunday school or from pop culture, actually obscure that internal logic. We tend to bring our own modern definitions to the text instead of painstakingly extracting the definitions from the text.
And when you finally stop importing our modern 21st century definitions of land or Israel or fire, the whole picture just completely shifts.
Drastically. It's almost unrecognizable.
And he teases this huge aha moment right at the beginning of the essay, which we are definitely going to get to, that revolves around a massive historical translation error regarding serpents.
It's a total game changer. It really is the master key that unlocks the whole essay. It literally turns the primary villain of the biblical story into something else entirely.
Okay, let's unpack this properly. We're going to go section by section here. Section 1, we need to redefine the map. Because usually when people read Israel or the land, they immediately picture a specific place on a globe.
Right. They think of a GPS coordinate. They treat it as a noun. You are either physically born within those borders or you aren't.
But Enfield says we need to stop doing that. He argues that Israel is actually a verb, not a noun.
This is a crucial distinction to grasp. To really understand this, we have to go all the way back to the origin of the name itself. We have to go back to Genesis 32 and look at the story of Jacob.
Jacob, the ultimate trickster.
Exactly. Jacob, the heel grabber. The guy who has basically been running and scheming and manipulating his whole life. He is alone at night by the river Jabbok. He's absolutely terrified because his brother Esau is coming the next day with an army, and Jacob thinks Esau is going to kill him. And then completely out of nowhere, he gets jumped.
Right, by a, quote, man, the text says.
A man who turns out to be the angel of the Lord, or a pre-incarnate manifestation of God himself. And they wrestle. And you have to remember, this isn't some polite theological debate. This is dust and sweat and grunting. It is literal physical combat, and it lasts all night long.
And Jacob just refuses to let go. I mean, even when his hip gets completely dislocated, he just hangs on for dear life.
He stubbornly clings to his opponent. And at the end of that brutal match, just as the sun is coming up, the being finally says, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed."
So the wrestling match is actually the birth of the name.
Yes, exactly. He doesn't get the name Israel simply because he was born to the right parents. He receives the name only after he violently wrestles with God. The name itself describes an action. It describes a profound event. Identity in the deep biblical sense is always based on active engagement, not passive birth.
So you can't just passively be Israel by default. You actually have to do Israel.
In a spiritual sense, yes. It's entirely covenantal, it's relational. Enfield points out that the Apostle Paul picks up on this exact thread heavily in the New Testament. In Romans 9, verse 6, Paul drops that really famous line where he says, "For they are not all Israel who are of Israel."
Which I always thought sounded like a riddle. Like, what does it mean they aren't Israel who are Israel?
It definitely sounds paradoxical to a modern ear, but it is completely consistent with the ancient Hebrew prophets. Paul is basically saying that just because you have the physical ethnic marker, the noun, doesn't mean you are actually functioning in the covenant reality, the verb. You can be genetically descended from Jacob, but remain completely spiritually disconnected from the reality of Israel. And then in Galatians 3, Paul flips it the other way, saying, if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring.
So identity is totally fluid based on your spiritual position, not your genetic code.
Correct. And if Israel is a spiritual condition, a continuous state of wrestling and remaining in covenant with God, then the land must be interpreted in the exact same way.
Okay, this is the part that really shifts the entire reading of Zechariah for me.
Yeah.
Because Zechariah explicitly says, in all the land, 2/3 shall be cut off. If the land isn't a physical territory, what exactly is it?
Enfield argues that the land actually represents the state of the covenant. It's the spiritual theater where the relationship with God is constantly enacted. But, and here's the massive twist, when that covenant is broken, when the people fall out of spiritual alignment, the land becomes something else entirely. It devolves into what he calls the tannin state.
The tannin state. We are definitely going to get to the definition of tannin in a minute. But broadly speaking, does this essentially mean the domain of the flesh or the domain of human empire?
Yes, precisely. Think of it as a deeply ingrained mindset. Being in the land in the context of this dark prophecy isn't about physically standing on dirt in the Middle East. It's about being trapped in a specific spiritual mindset, specifically the arrogant mindset of Pharaoh. It's the human condition of total self-reliance, of unchecked ego, of operating within the corrupt world system.
So when the prophecy says people are stuck in the land, it essentially implies they are trapped in the matrix. They are fully embedded in the system of the world that operates completely apart from God.
Exactly. And realizing that changes the stakes of the entire passage completely. It means the prophecy isn't threatening to violently kick people out of a geographical location. It's actually talking about how to rescue them out of a deadly spiritual trap.
Right, because if you are trapped inside a burning building, being cut off from that building is a really good thing.
That's the exact logic here. Being cut off from the land, being severed from the tannin state, is actually a profound act of spiritual liberation. It is an internal exodus.
Man, okay, that is a massive conceptual shift. But to really understand this tannin state and why it's called that, we have to talk about the snakes. Because honestly, this was the part of the essay where my jaw just kind of hit the floor.
Ah, yes, the two serpents distinction.
Right, because in our English Bibles and just in our general cultural understanding, a snake is a snake is a snake. And all snakes are inherently bad.
That is definitely the traditional cultural view.
Right.
We see a serpent in a text, and we immediately think Satan. We think of absolute evil. We instantly think of the garden and the fall of humanity.
But Enfield claims this is a catastrophic collapse in our modern translation. He says the original Hebrew Bible actually uses two completely different words for serpents, and they are absolutely not synonyms. In fact, they are polar opposites.
Yes, they are. The two primary Hebrew words are nahash and tannin. And understanding the deep distinction between these two concepts is absolutely vital to understanding the true meaning of Zechariah 13.
Okay, let's start with the Nahash. This is the specific word used back in the Garden of Eden, right in Genesis 3.
Correct. And this is exactly where Enfield asks us to look really, really closely at the original text, completely stripped of our Sunday school filters. The word Nahash actually derives from a root verb that means to whisper, to divine, or to discern. The specific adjective used to describe this serpent in the text is arum.
Which in my Bible is usually translated as crafty or subtle.
Right, often with a very sinister or negative connotation attached to it. But that exact same Hebrew word arum is used heavily throughout the book of Proverbs to describe a deeply wise person, like where it says, the prudent man, the arum man, sees danger and hides himself.
So the text is actually introducing this garden being as incredibly wise.
Wise.
Yeah.
Prudent. Highly discriminating. Enfield heavily points out that the Nahash in Genesis 3 isn't introduced as just a normal animal. It's not simply part of the livestock or the dumb beasts of the field created in the previous chapter in the sense of reproducing after its kind.
It's more like a unique being of wisdom stationed at the tree of knowledge.
Right. It is actively engaging in high-level theological discourse with Eve. And here's where it gets incredibly interesting. When God pronounces the consequence on the Nahash in Genesis 3, verse 14, we usually just read it as a straightforward curse. God says, "Cursed are you above all livestock."
Right, which sounds like a massive demotion. Like you used to be this cool, smart, upright being, and now you're just a dirty belly crawler.
But Enfield looks at the specific Hebrew preposition used there, which is mikol. It literally means from among or more than. In an ancient liturgical or priestly context, being cursed, mikol, meaning cursed more than or set apart from the others, can actually imply being consecrated for a specific difficult purpose.
Consecrated for what exactly?
Well, the text says, "Dust you shall eat all the days of your life."
Yeah, eating dirt.
But you have to remember what Adam is made of. What is the material?
Dust. Genesis 2 says God formed man of the dust of the ground.
And what exactly does God say Adam will return to at the moment of death?
Dust you are, and to dust you shall return.
So for the Nahash to be specifically assigned by God to eat dust isn't just an arbitrary dietary restriction. It's a divine vocation. It profoundly means the Nahash is assigned to consume or bear the ultimate consequence of human mortality. It literally takes the dust, the human death, into itself.
Wow, that is a completely different way to look at it. It makes the garden snake sound almost like a sin eater. Or someone bearing the weight of death for humanity.
In a very real theological sense, yes, it willingly bears the burden.
But surely the snake is still the bad guy, right? I mean, come on, it's the snake.
Well, Enfield provides what he calls the smoking gun evidence here. And honestly, it's very hard to argue with his logic once you see it. He points directly to the book of Numbers, chapter 21.
Oh, the story of the bronze serpent.
Exactly. The Israelites are in the wilderness, and they are dying from venomous snake bites. And incidentally, the text says these are Nahash bites. So God explicitly tells Moses to forge a bronze Nahash and mount it high on a pole, and everyone who looks at it is instantly healed.
And Enfield's main point here is that God simply wouldn't use a literal symbol of the devil to physically heal his covenant people.
Exactly. If the Nahash was inherently demonic, fundamentally evil at its core, making a bronze image of it and commanding people to look at it for salvation would be blatant idolatry. It would be absolute blasphemy under the law. God does not use demonic symbols as the primary instruments for holy redemption. But the argument goes even further. Who explicitly refers back to this exact wilderness story in the New Testament?
Jesus does, in John chapter 3, verse 14.
Yes, Jesus says, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." Jesus explicitly and intentionally compares himself to the lifted Nahash.
He doesn't say, as Moses lifted up the lamb or the dove.
No, he specifically chooses the serpent. Enfield essentially argues that the Nahash is actually a positive biblical archetype. It deeply represents wisdom that is entirely willing to sacrifice itself, willing to, quote, become sin, unquote, willing to intimately bear the dust of human mortality in order to bring about true healing.
And there's a fascinating mathematical connection too, right, involving gematria.
Yes, in ancient Hebrew numerology, where every single letter corresponds to a specific numerical value. The total numerical value of the Hebrew word Nahash is 358. And the numerical value of the word Mashiach, which means Messiah, is exactly the same, 358.
Okay, that is genuinely spooky, but like in a really good way.
It absolutely suggests they share a profound symbolic space in the ancient mind. The Nahash is essentially the prototype of the suffering Messiah, the one who willingly becomes a curse in order to heal the dying people.
Okay, so Nahash equals profound wisdom, willing sacrifice, and basically a Christ-like figure. Got it. Now we desperately have to talk about the other snake. Because if the Nahash is actually the good archetype, who on earth is the bad guy?
That would be the Tannin.
Tannin.
Yes, if the Nahash represents humble wisdom and self-sacrifice, the Tannin represents utter chaos, concentrated worldly power, and brutal imperial coercion.
Human empire, basically.
Yes. The classic defining example of this is in Exodus, when Moses goes into the court to confront Pharaoh. He throws his wooden staff down on the floor. Now, we usually just say it turns into a snake. But the original text in Exodus chapter 7 does not use the word Nahash there.
Wait, so it deliberately switches the vocabulary?
It intentionally switches the word to Tannin, because Moses is directly confronting Pharaoh, the ultimate emperor. He is heavily escalating the conflict. He's meeting raw worldly power with divine power. A Tannin in the ancient Near East is a sea monster, a terrifying dragon, a sheer symbol of raw, crushing dominion. It's basically a biblical kaiju.
And the essay explicitly mentions the prophet Ezekiel describing Pharaoh himself as a Tannin, right?
Yes, in Ezekiel 29, verse 3. God says, "Behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great Tannin lying in the midst of his rivers." And here is the absolute defining philosophical characteristic of the Tannin. The verse immediately continues with Pharaoh saying, "My Nile is my own. I made it."
My Nile is my own. That is just the ultimate statement of human ego.
That is exactly what Enfield calls the Pharaoh logic. It's the delusion of self-originating authority. It's the mindset of, I don't need God. I made myself. I totally own my resources. I am the absolute source of my own power. That is the true dark spirit of the Tannin.
So to summarize, we have these two opposing ancient archetypes. The Nahash, the one who humbly serves, sacrifices, and heals humanity. And the Tannin, the one who violently hoards, dominates, and falsely claims to be a god.
Precisely. And I know it sounds completely counterintuitive at first until you consistently apply the spiritual anatomy we just established. If the land actually is the Tannin state, the toxic state of sin, ego, and total separation from God, then do you really want to stay in it?
No, absolutely not. You want out as fast as possible.
Exactly. So being cut off from that toxic land is actually a beautiful liberation. Enfield profoundly connects this to the spiritual principle Paul lays out in Galatians 2:20, where Paul says, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live."
So the quote-unquote death of the two-thirds in Zechariah isn't actually a physical bodily death at all. It's the spiritual death of the human ego.
It is the absolute voluntary death of the false self. The two-thirds group represent the people who willingly follow the Nahash path. They consciously choose wisdom. They choose the pain of sacrifice. They deliberately choose to die to the corrupt world system voluntarily. They boldly say, "My Nile is not my own," and in doing so, their old false identity completely perishes.
And is that why they just seemingly disappear from the text? Because the essay makes a big point that they don't show up at the very end of the prophecy.
Right, and traditionally people always ask, well, where did the two-thirds physically go? Did they go to heaven? Enfield says they didn't go anywhere geographically. They were simply fully absorbed into the ultimate purpose of God. He brilliantly uses the ancient analogy of refining dross in silver. When a silversmith refines silver, you aggressively remove the worthless dross. You don't ask, where is the dross now? It's just gone. Its complete removal was the entire point of the fire. The two-thirds simply are the flesh that has been willingly cut away so the true spirit can finally live.
So the two-thirds are essentially the Galatians 2:20 crowd. They died with Christ voluntarily. They are completely free.
Yes, which unfortunately leaves us with the remaining one-third, the so-called survivors.
The ones who were tragically left, quote, in the land, unquote.
And remember, being left in the land fundamentally means being left trapped in the Tannin condition.
So these aren't the lucky, blessed, chosen ones at all. These are actually the dangerously stubborn ones.
Precisely. They are the stubbornly resistant remnant. They are the ones frantically clinging to their false pharaoh identity. They are still standing there saying, "My Nile is my own. I am the master of my fate." They fundamentally haven't chosen the voluntary death of the ego like the two-thirds did.
The essay does make a careful point to say they aren't, quote, wicked, unquote, like simple cartoon villains, right?
No, and that is a hugely important nuance. It's not that they are necessarily malicious or uniquely evil people in some simplistic moralistic sense. It's that they are deeply hostile to God in a purely structural sense. The Apostle Paul in Romans 8, verse 7 explicitly says the mind that is set on the flesh cannot possibly submit to God. It's structurally incapable of doing so.
Because fundamentally, you just can't serve two masters. You can't actively be your own pharaoh and authentically serve the true God at the exact same time.
Correct. The core nature of the human ego desperately wants to be God. That is the very essence of the tannin. So the one-third mathematically represents the people who simply will not let go of control. They absolutely won't choose the necessary death of the self voluntarily.
Yeah.
And because they stubbornly won't choose it,
The intense fire has to eventually choose it for them.
exactly. And that naturally leads us right into section 4, the true nature of the fire.
Right, this is Zechariah 13, verse 9. I will put this third into the fire and refine them as one refines silver.
Now, traditionally, in a lot of theology, fire in the Bible is almost exclusively read as pure punishment, like eternal hellfire, divine wrath, an angry God just aggressively burning things up because he's mad.
But Enfield forcefully argues it's entirely remedial. It's an intervention for fixing things, not for just mindlessly destroying people.
Just look at the very specific analogy Zechariah intentionally uses, a skilled refiner of precious silver. The prophet Malachi in chapter 3 uses the exact same vivid image. The ancient refiner sits incredibly close and carefully watches the intensely hot fire. And why does he do that?
To see exactly when the precious metal is finally pure,
And how exactly do they know when it's pure?
when they can perfectly see their own reflection in it.
Exactly right. The fire isn't put there to maliciously burn up the good silver. It's there strictly to violently burn away the stubborn dross that is heavily clinging to the silver. The intense fire specifically targets the tannin identity, not the core person. It violently burns away the fake pharaoh mask so the true beautiful image of God can finally be seen underneath.
So the fire is basically just a mandated, forced Galatians 2:20 experience for those who refuse to do it voluntarily.
That is a genuinely brilliant way to synthesize it, yes. The two-thirds beautifully chose the cross voluntarily. The stubborn one-third absolutely required the terrifying fire to forcefully bring them to the exact same necessary point of ego death.
This directly connects to a really scary apocalyptic figure in the Bible that the essay entirely reinterprets. Apollyon, the destroyer from Revelation chapter 9.
Yes, a figure who is usually depicted in pop culture as a horrifying independent demon lord rising from the bottomless pit, like a dark general of hell.
But Enfield argues quite convincingly that Apollyon is actually just a mechanical function.
A destroying function operating entirely under strict divine command. Yes. Look closely at the actual text in Revelation 9. It says the key to the shaft of the abyss is given to him. The verb there is heavily passive. That grammatically implies clear authorization from a higher power.
Right, God actively gave him the key. He didn't steal it.
And then the terrifying locusts are given incredibly strict military rules of engagement. They're told do not kill anyone, only torment them, and only specifically target the people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads.
That definitely sounds like a disciplined army operating with a strict divine commander, not just some chaotic demonic mob running wild.
It perfectly parallels the ancient Passover story in Exodus. The quote-unquote destroyer who tragically killed the firstborn of Egypt wasn't some rogue independent demon doing whatever he wanted. It was a precise agent of divine judgment, operating under incredibly strict covenantal rules. Pass over the doors, painted with blood, it absolutely obeyed boundaries.
So the destroyer or Apollyon is essentially just the severe mechanism God ultimately uses to forcefully break the human ego when all else fails.
Yes, the essay references Psalm 36, verse 6, where David writes, "Your judgments are like the great deep." The abyss in Revelation isn't necessarily a literal fiery hell, it's the profound depth of God's unsearchable judgment. So the refining fire, the destroyer Apollyon, all of these are simply the severe tools used to finally crush the stubborn pharaoh identity simply because the person tragically wouldn't let go of it themselves.
It really reminds me of the Jacob story again. He wrestled forcefully all night long. He stubbornly wouldn't give up control, so God essentially had to violently dislocate his hip.
Exactly. That painful hip dislocation was the physical fire for Jacob. It was the necessary destroyer function. It really hurt. It was a profound trauma. But it was absolutely the only way to finally break Jacob's immense self-reliance and forcefully turn him into Israel. The severe fire in Zechariah is simply the necessary hip dislocation for the stubborn one-third.
Okay, so this is all very deeply spiritual and heavily internal. But the essay takes a really sharp turn in section 5 that I honestly wasn't expecting at all. It suddenly connects this ancient tannin concept to modern political theory, specifically using the structure of the U.S. Declaration of Independence.
This is what he terms the civic tannin. And it really helps forcefully ground the seemingly abstract idea in stark modern reality. Because the truth is, We don't just have internal private egos. We actually build massive external systems and governments based entirely on those egos.
So walk us through the specific political hierarchy the essay describes there.
Infield looks closely at the foundational political theory of the Declaration. It establishes a very strict vertical chain of command. At the absolute top, you have the source, meaning God or nature. In the middle, you have inherent rights, which are directly given by the source. And at the very bottom, you have government, which is merely created by men to secure those pre-existing rights.
Okay, so source, then rights, then government at the bottom.
Right. Government is fundamentally at the bottom of the ladder.
Yeah.
It is designed to be a servant. It absolutely does not mathematically create rights. It only protects them.
Right.
But the ultimate Tannen move, the Pharaoh move, is to violently invert that natural hierarchy.
So the government essentially tries to usurp the top spot from God.
Exactly. When the state arrogantly claims to be the actual manufacturer of human rights, instead of just the humble guardian of them, it is boldly making the ancient Tannen claim. It is essentially standing there saying, my Nile is my own. I generously give you your human rights, and therefore I can violently take them away whenever I please.
And the essay refers to this modern condition as, quote, administered status, unquote.
Yes. The essay calls this terrifying system the paywall. It's what happens when inherent human rights become mere priced permissions. When your fundamental human dignity isn't inherent just because you are a human beautifully made in the image of God, but is completely contingent on your fragile status granted by the state.
So translating this back to the prophecy in modern terms, the land or the Tannen state is basically any human system, whether it's political or corporate or even a social hierarchy, where the system arrogantly replaces God as the ultimate source of human value.
Yes. If you deeply believe your fundamental value comes from the state, or from your fancy job or your massive bank account, you are currently living in the land. You are completely trapped in the Tannen condition. And that condition is incredibly fragile because it depends entirely on a deeply flawed human system.
And the, quote, resultant man, unquote, which is the person who finally comes out of the refining fire, is someone who has been completely liberated from that toxic dependency.
They finally know deep in their bones that their value comes exclusively from the source. The state absolutely can't give it, and the state absolutely can't take it away. And honestly, that makes them incredibly dangerous to the Tannen system.
Because fundamentally, you just can't threaten a man who is already dead to the system.
Precisely. If you have already voluntarily perished to the world system, if you have already fully accepted the painful death of the ego, the corrupt system essentially has zero leverage on you anymore. You are utterly free.
Man, let's move to the end game here. Section 6, because we really have to talk about where this entire intense process is actually leading. The terrifying lake of fire from Revelation chapter 20.
Ah, yes, the ultimate scary verse that terrifies everyone.
Right, where it literally says death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire.
Now, I want you to ask yourself a logical question here. Are death and Hades actual, literal human people?
Well, no. I guess they are concepts or spiritual realities.
They are functional roles. They are administrative functions within the cosmos. Death is a severing function. Hades is merely a temporary holding place. The beast and the false prophet are repeatedly described as structural roles, two massive structures of anti-God power and deception.
So when the apocalyptic text violently says they are thrown into the fiery lake,
It profoundly means the role itself is permanently consumed. The function is completely abolished forever. The essay heavily argues that the lake of fire isn't some eternal underground torture chamber for human beings. It is actually just the unveiled absolute holiness of God himself. Remember, the book of Hebrews explicitly says our God is a consuming fire.
wait, so the lake of fire literally eyes God?
In his raw, completely unfiltered, overwhelming holiness, yes.
Yeah.
And here's the profound ontological argument Enfield makes. Evil, fundamentally, is privation. Evil is merely a lack of good. It's exactly like a dark shadow. It literally has no actual substance of its own.
So logically, what happens to a dark shadow when you simply turn on a slightly brighter light? It just instantly disappears?
Exactly. Privation mathematically cannot survive in the presence of infinite fullness. When God is finally all in all, as 1 Corinthians chapter 15 beautifully says, there is simply no room left for the shadow to exist. The destroying function Apollyon is destroyed simply because there's absolutely nothing left to destroy. Death itself is destroyed because there's no one left to die.
This perfectly leads to what he calls a unified outcome. And this is the part of the essay that I genuinely think gives people the most profound hope. The terrifying prophecy in Zechariah doesn't actually end with two divided groups fighting each other forever in eternity.
No, it absolutely doesn't. It beautifully ends with one single unified declaration. Look at verse 9. They will say, "The Lord is my God."
And then God actively responds and says, "They are my people."
Note the extreme singularity there. It's absolutely not. Group A is my beloved people, and Group B is screaming in the eternal pit. It's a completely unified, joyful covenant conclusion.
So basically, whether you were in the two-thirds group who bravely died voluntarily, or you were in the stubborn one-third group who forcefully went through the agonizing fire, the ultimate destination is exactly the same for everyone.
Yes, they all become the resultant man. The beautifully purified silver.
Yeah.
The person who perfectly reflects the refiner's face without any distortion.
Now, I should clarify, it's not universalism in the cheap modern sense of just, hey, everyone gets a free pass, right?
No, absolutely not. It's definitely not everyone is perfectly fine exactly as they are right now. It is rather everyone will be ruthlessly refined. The toxic dross absolutely must go. The arrogant tannin identity absolutely must burn to ash. For the two-thirds, it gracefully burns via the cross, which is a voluntary submission. For the one-third, it terrifyingly burns via the judgment, which is an involuntary submission. But the glorious mathematical result is exactly the same. The dross is permanently gone. Only the true, beloved covenant partner remains.
God all in all.
That is exactly the scripture. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 28. It intentionally does not say God and some lucky people while the rest burn forever. It plainly says God all in all.
Man, okay. That is honestly a massive amount of heavy theology to process, but it brilliantly turns a horrific slasher movie horror story into a profound eternal love story, essentially. A very severe, tough love story, to be sure, but an absolute love story nonetheless.
It radically turns a depressing story of future military slaughter into a deeply hopeful story of total spiritual transformation.
So just briefly summarizing the massive conceptual shift here today, we started out looking at Zechariah 13 as this terrifying geopolitical prediction of World War III, and we ended with understanding it as an incredibly precise, intimate map of the human soul.
We completely moved from flat geography to deep spiritual anatomy. We clearly saw the two ancient serpents, the Nahash, who is wisdom in Christ, who willingly bears the heavy burden for others, versus the Tannin, who is Pharaoh, and the ego, who selfishly hoards power.
And we finally realized that the ultimate goal of the prophecy isn't just trying to physically survive a terrifying war, but to bravely survive the necessary spiritual refining.
To ultimately become the purest silver.
Right. Well, here is my final thought for today, and maybe a slightly provocative question for you listening to us right now. We talked heavily about the two-thirds and the one-third today. The two-thirds actively choose the painful death of the ego. They bravely choose to let go of that toxic flower, my nihilist, my own mindset, long before the intense fire ever comes. But the one-third, they just stubbornly wait. They desperately cling to it until it is forcefully ripped away from them.
It really presents an incredibly stark everyday choice. Not just some distant choice of heaven or hell in the afterlife, but a very real choice of exactly how you want to go through the necessary transformation right now in this life.
Exactly. The question is, do you want to be the two-thirds? Do you want to bravely volunteer for the death of your pride, your desperate need to constantly control everything, your deeply ingrained dependency on the human system? Or do you stubbornly want to be the one-third and just wait for the terrifying fire to forcefully do it for you?
Because honestly, either way, the toxic dross simply doesn't survive the end of the story.
Yeah.
But the precious silver absolutely does.
That is the ultimate key takeaway right there. The dross always goes, the silver always stays.
And as Enfield so beautifully concludes his essay, the ancient prophecy doesn't end with a traumatized survivor. It ends with a beautiful covenant.
That is just incredibly deep stuff. Thank you so much for diving in with us today. We will see you on the next deep dive.
You know, there's a prophecy in the Hebrew Bible that, on the surface, sounds absolutely terrifying. It reads like a horrific apocalypse, a literal culling of a population. And for centuries, that's pretty much how it's been understood, as a story of judgment and mass death. But what if we've been missing the point entirely? Today, based on the work of Zachary David Enfield, we're going to explore a completely radical reinterpretation, one where this prophecy of fire isn't about destruction at all, but about a really profound spiritual transformation.
This one question, it just flips the entire narrative on its head. I mean, instead of some tragic top-down judgment, could this prophecy actually be describing a willing exodus, a necessary death that actually leads to a greater life? To even begin to understand how that could be possible, we have to look at the verse that's caused all this confusion in the first place.
And there it is. It's stark. It's brutal. And it seems so straightforward, right? 2/3 perish, 1/3 is left. You can totally see why this has been read as just immense physical suffering and death. But the argument we're exploring suggests the key isn't in what the words say on the surface, but in what those words symbolize. Okay, so to crack this puzzle open, we have to start by redefining our terms. The central idea here is that words we think we know, words like Israel and the land, well, they aren't just about a place on a map or a specific ethnic group. They're pointing to something much, much deeper.
This verse from the Apostle Paul is really the foundation for this whole argument. Think about the name Israel itself. It was given to Jacob after he wrestled with God. So it describes a state of engagement, a way of being, not just a bloodline. So Israel in this context is a spiritual identity.
And if Israel is a spiritual identity, it makes sense that the land of Israel is also a spiritual reality. In this reading, the land is the state a person is operating from, either aligned with God or in a state of self-declared sovereignty. And this idea, well, this brings us to the master key that unlocks the entire prophecy.
Okay, so the Hebrew text makes this critical distinction that many translations have just collapsed into a single idea. It uses two totally different words for serpentine beings. One is Nachash, and the other is Tanin. Understanding the difference between these two, well, it changes everything.
So first, we have the Nahash. Now, the argument is that this is not a symbol of evil. In Genesis, it's described with a word that means wise or prudent. And think about this. When Moses lifts up a bronze serpent to heal the Israelites in the desert, that's a Nahash. Jesus even compares his own crucifixion to that very act. So the Nahash is actually a symbol of redemptive wisdom. And then you have the Tanin. This is a totally different concept. This represents imperial power, coercive systems. The prophet Ezekiel explicitly calls Pharaoh the great Tannin lying in his river, who boasts, "My Nile is my own, I made it." The Tannin is any system that declares itself the ultimate source of authority.
So, you see the crucial point here, right? Nahash is a redemptive archetype, while Tannin is an imperial one. One represents yielding to a higher wisdom, and the other represents declaring oneself the highest power. They are complete opposites.
Okay, so what is this? A random number? 358? This might seem like a bit of a detour, but stick with me, because it's a fascinating piece of the puzzle that's literally embedded in the text itself.
This is what's known as gematria, a kind of numerical signature baked into the Hebrew text. The numerical value of the word for serpent, Nachash, is 358. And what's absolutely incredible is that the numerical value for the word Messiah, Mashiach, is also 358. This just powerfully reinforces the idea that the Nahash was never meant to be a symbol of evil, but a prototype for the Messiah.
So, with these new definitions in our back pocket, we can finally go back to those shocking fractions in the prophecy. Let's look at them again, but this time through this brand new lens.
So we have 2/3 that perish and 1/3 that is left in it. But remember, what is the land? It's that spiritual condition of self-sovereignty. It's the Tanin state. To be in the land is to be trapped in that ego-driven system. And here is the radical shift. The 2/3 who are cut off and perish aren't being punished. They're being liberated. Their death is a willing death to the ego, an exodus from the Tanin state. They're being cut off from the land, not destroyed on it. See the difference? And this concept, it's actually echoed all throughout the New Testament. It's this willing death to the old self, the self that says, "My Nile is my own." In this reading, the 2/3 are the ones who voluntarily choose this path of surrender. So here's how the whole process breaks down. Step 1, the land is the ego's domain. Step 2, 2/3 of the people willingly die to that ego and are liberated. But then there's the 1/3 who resists. They remain in the land, clinging to that identity. And it's this group that has to pass through the refining fire. So what exactly is this fire? I mean, the traditional view is that it's a fire of punishment, right? But in this framework, its purpose is entirely different. It's not about consuming people, it's about consuming the roles they play. This verse from the book of Revelation gives us the ultimate clue. I mean, think about it for a second. Death and Hades are not people. They're conditions, they're abstract concepts. So how can they be thrown into a fire unless that fire is designed to consume abstract things? And that's the claim.
The lake of fire is the place where impersonal constructs are finally abolished. It's a fire that purges systems and ideologies and conditions, leaving the person totally free.
And these are its targets: the beast, the false prophet, the dragon. These are all just different names for the tannin system of coercive power. Even death itself is a condition that is ultimately consumed and abolished, not just, quarantined somewhere. So, this rereading, it leads us to a completely different conclusion to the story of judgment and redemption, one where the goal isn't separation, but total restoration for everyone and everything. Think of it like a silversmith. A refiner doesn't put silver into the fire to destroy it. Of course not. He does it to burn away the impurities, all the dross, until he can look into the purified metal and see his own face reflected back at him. In the exact same way, this fire consumes the tannin construct, so the true, restored person can finally emerge.
And this is the ultimate endpoint, a state where all opposition, all systems of control, all those self-declared sovereignties have finally been dissolved. What's left is a unified reality. Not just God in some things, but as the Apostle Paul writes, God all in all.
So we end right where we began, with a question. If this final refining fire consumes systems of control and not people, what does that change? Well, it reframes a prophecy of terror into one of ultimate hope, a story that doesn't end with just a few survivors, but with a fully restored creation. And that difference, well, that's everything.